Crazy Stupid Podcast.
Thank you all so much for tuning in. If this is your first time here, we'd love for you to hit that subscribe button and the like, and also turn on that bell so that you are made aware of when we are posting things.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of Crazy Stupid Podcast. Today, we have a few different things that we're going to discuss. We watched another classic anime. I don't know why we keep doing this. Do they make happy animes? This is getting out of hand.
I know.
And then there's some pop culture things we want to talk about, and also
Stop cheating.
Death Note. We just finished watching Grave of the Fireflies. This is an anime film that came out in 1988, I believe.
Yeah.
It is the story of a brother and sister trying to survive on their own in Japan during World War II. And it is absolutely tragic.
Yes. I read a lot about what the director was really
I read a
going
bit
for.
about it too, and I disagree with him entirely.
Yeah.
I just think it's so obviously anti-war. I don't understand how I don't understand how to watch this movie and not come away with that message. I kind of don't. There's definitely other things going on.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't understand how one could view this movie and not see that.
It's like he wanted to talk about young adults and adolescents surviving in a failed society.
Yes, but the society failed because
of the war. The first thing that I definitely thought about is just the PTSD that happens in war for a lot of these abandoned, mostly rural areas that get hit the most, and how for a lot of times the film does a good job at depicting how they had to find or create happiness despite all of the horror that's happening around them. And that sort of led me to my second point, which is we did have two horrific incidents in our country. But for the most, 9/11 Pearl Harbor.
Pearl Harbor.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, Pearl Harbor.
Say sorry to Ben Affleck in his movie.
No. Although I enjoyed it.
But for the most part, our country has done a pretty exceptional job at not allowing war zones on our footsteps outside of the Civil War. So invading foreign countries, that isn't something that we really have to experience that often. And so I do think there is a glamour that our country has with the idea of war. Like you see it in our media, you see it in our pop culture, you see it in the films that often get the Oscar nods, right? Dunkirk, 1917. And I don't always feel like that is the glamour doesn't feel like it's the same for other countries, because I think the other countries have a lot more nuance, because so often war came directly to their doorsteps. And I don't think America can fully understand that because it's never happened to us in the same way. Like, this film did a phenomenal job at showing you the constant alarms going off. And whenever you feel like you're getting into a pattern of just healthy living, the alarm goes off and you're right back into that post-traumatic state. You can just never escape it. I just think that is something that Americans should think about when we think about the wars that we claim to have won. This is not something glamourful. It isn't something to boast about. It's not like this isn't something to flex on, but I feel like we've got that culture where like we kind of do. Even the way that we sort of glamorized guns and new weapons in the military.
Yeah, that's kind of a lot of where I started thinking about it too, is like, just because of how we are situated geographically, we just don't really bear the consequences of any of the wars that America wages. Mm-hmm. And so a lot of what happens in war is that regular everyday people are paying the price for decisions of powerful people, while those powerful people are usually pretty shielded from any consequence or responsibility that comes. Whereas in America, that's not the case. I don't think that glamorizing war is unique to America. I think it is an aspect of war propaganda that happens everywhere. And I think that this film did sort of show that. There is this idea that people talk about this with America during World War II, and then they pointed it out in this movie about Japan during World War II. But there is this idea that, like, in wartime, you know, the country bands together, and it's all, you know, collectivism, and we're all, yes, we all do our part. Everybody's a part of this thing, right? And it's like, it's this idea that during wartime, you know, the differences between Americans, you know, didn't matter. Women went into the workforce, and the language is implying this idea of we're taking care of each other. But I think what this movie did a really good job of showing is that you're not taking care of each other. You're putting forth your efforts in service to your country.
Right.
And what this movie is showing is that this idea of country is disconnected from care for other people.
Right.
And that within this system, people who were not able to, or who chose to prioritize care for each other versus service to their country, like the brother did for his sister, they are excluded from this system of care, and they are then discarded and forgotten and left to fend for themselves. And in the end, it cost them their lives because they couldn't do it. They're children, and they're not being cared for. And I was reading that the director, that was one of the things he wanted to point out, was war as society's failure to protect its own citizens and people.
Such a good line.
It's such a good line because we think about war as an act of protection. That's how we think about it. That's how they propagandize war in America, but other places too. That's how you get people bought in to this system where everybody's doing their part, not to care for the citizens, but to make it possible for the country to continue to put forth all of its resources into this effort, right? But you do that by getting people bought into this idea and then abandoning their sense of care for each other.
Yeah.
To me, that's how this film felt very anti-war, is that it's, or maybe it's anti-war propaganda more specifically, but it's showing that the act of war is never, almost never, an act of protection for the people. It's an act of dominance and power. And you're doing this, countries do this to declare their world dominance, to put their power on display. And in America, and I assume elsewhere, we have internalized this idea that that is done for our protection. And in America, it can feel like it works because of what you were saying, because we do not live the everyday realities of war.
Right.
But that has a lot less to do with how America does politics and a lot more to do with it's literally geography. Like, we're bordered by two countries that are not going to wage war on us, and geographically how we are situated protects us the vast majority of the time. But it's still true that we are not benefiting. Like, you as an individual, as a regular everyday citizen, you do not benefit from war, and the people in charge know that. That's not why they do it.
Yeah.
So I do think this film did a really good job of driving home that point of, like, how invasive war propaganda is, and how it functions to make war possible and to activize people, and how it also ends up leaving people left behind. In a lot of movies about war, it's like the war directly, like the violence of the war is usually what causes death. And in this case, that's not what happened. They survived every air raid in this film. They died because of the failure of people to take care of them, because they didn't have food. And and all of the people that they went to who should have been responsible for helping them in some way, the doctor, the family member, and even just random people that they went to, everybody failed them. And so in the end, like, it wasn't even like the war itself or the violence of the war, the things that you think about when you think about death tolls in war that killed them. It was just genuinely the fact that people did not there was no sense of interpersonal responsibility, like responsibility for each other.
Even people within the war, whether it's through class or maybe it's different houses or families that are a bit more prestige. You remember like towards the end, I picked it up as like these like rich valley girls coming back to this rural area, which they had the privilege of leaving. And they're like, oh, we finally get a chance to come back. You know, the war's done. And like, oh, I missed this place, the view. I missed this view, yada, 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 yada. Like if you really wanted to see how class becomes an issue when a country goes through something like war or some form of like, you know, like a Great Depression, you really start to see how absurd a class system is, where this individuals, they can just like avoid the problems, avoid the trauma just due to their class standing, and then come back to that area and have like no awareness of the trauma that's just sort of in the atmosphere now. Like to them, those girls that came back, it was like a summer break. Like they're able to come back home, and all the while they have no idea of what they just missed.
That's good. Yeah.
I did want to think about like, there's a lot of conversation. You know, we talked a little bit about this earlier of like, I do wonder as we watch more anime, like what are people preferring? Do they prefer dub or do they prefer sub in the animes that they watch?
I just thought there was a general consensus that people prefer sub.
I think from what I've seen online, there is a pretty strong group of like dub fans. I guess in their mind, they may just like prefer the English version. I just feel like it doesn't land.
No, every time we like, could we not find the sub version of this? Because every time
I kind of didn't think about it, and I was just like, well, we're like 25 minutes in, it's too late.
I thought about it as soon as it started, but we'd already paid for it, so it's like, here we are.
It is also a little weird because a lot of these times, these English voice actors are not Japanese.
They're the most American,
and it throws me off. I'm
Yeah,
sorry, it
they're
throws
the
me
most American
off.
voices that they could have found. It's absolutely insane.
Oh my goodness! I know, like people would bring up like Full Metal. Apparently, it had like a good dubbed version. I tried watching a few minutes of that after watching the full sub version, and I was like, I have to turn this shit off. This ain't it. And it was going to ruin the experience for me.
Even that little thing in the middle, Full Metal Alchemist. Full Metal Alchemist. It's just like the most American sounding voices that they could possibly find.
I think the dramatized way, like the dramatized pronunciation of things, I just don't think Americans do it well in that context. They don't do it as well as the Japanese voice actors.
Part of me wonders if maybe the art of voice acting is more difficult when the piece is not originally in English. I wonder if it's just harder because I've heard...
But what makes that so difficult?
I don't know, but I remember in Spanish class, sometimes you watch the Spanish versions of our cartoons, and that sounded crazy too. It sounded crazy.
So Death Note, not to get too much into it, but I binged through Death Note. It was very different to watch that after coming off of Full Metal and then after coming off of Attack on Titan, because there was some similarities between the previous two, and Death Note was a strong pivot in terms of lore, in terms of content, in terms of style. Still very good, but not to give too much away. Obviously, you know, at some point, fingers crossed, you may watch it. And for people who haven't watched it, I'm not going to say too much, but just the idea of it, I think, is in pop culture enough for people to sort of have a general understanding. I thought about two things, and I think the show did a good job at portraying how Law and Order is not a viable or sustainable or permanent solution to whatever problems your society is dealing with. It's just a temporary fix. And I thought of two things. The first that I was thinking about was like the war on drugs, and very sort of swift, stern, very rigid sort of approach to the law. And we just saw people being incarcerated by the millions over like the next like 25 to 30 years once it started in our country. And it didn't fix the real problem. People who have the power to make the most change are uncomfortable in like removing the veil of what the real issues are. And it's more comfortable to just deal with the symptoms of the problems in our country. And so like he's trying to use this death note to like bring world peace, but everybody's just sort of like, it's just out of fear. You know what I mean? Like, and fear wears off. That's part of the problem that I think the show did a phenomenal job at portraying. Like, I remember what podcast I was listening to, but the author was talking about how when like people were threatened with like higher sentences, it didn't necessarily change their behavior. There were larger things happening in society that were more prominent in their life that led to whatever decision making that led them to doing. And so it wasn't just like fear of punishment just isn't enough to make the world better. And the show does a phenomenal job at portraying that. But the second thing that I was thinking of, I guess it was like a little bit more personal, was kind of like, excuse me, it's sort of based on like religion and organized religion, and how a lot of our salvation, the premise of our faith is built on like, if you are not a good person, like you will go to hell, right? And depending on your faith, some of it is a quick one, some of it is eternal. And I remember like as a kid internalizing that, where I wasn't being a good person for the sake of being a good person. I was being or trying to be a good person out of fear of losing my life. I don't know if there's always the clear difference between I'm doing this because I want to make it into heaven versus I'm doing this because I genuinely think it is the right thing to do. I don't know if Christians always make that distinction.
I don't 100% know how to make that distinction, I guess, because if you define what is the right thing by like what you believe God favors, like there's kind of no difference between like doing the right thing and doing the right thing to please God. You know what I mean? It's like,
I don't know.
How do you differentiate? Because personally, I've heard people say this about Christians before, where they'll have conversations and Christians will say things and then they're like, so you're saying that like you would be a terrible person like if you didn't believe in God, like you only do the right thing because you don't want to go to hell. And I feel like I never really took it like that. When Christians say things like that, I took it as Christians believe that the reason why they are able to do the right thing is because of God.
I think there can be instances where what we do is not based on guidelines scripture gave us, but more so on what we will inherit if we consistently do these things, right? Like part of our theology is like you get like different crowns when you get to heaven, and like some of these crowns are going to have more like diamonds on it, and that's sort of an indicator of like how good you were while you were here. There is almost like merit based, and I do think that can sometimes influence how we see the purpose of doing a good thing.
I feel like maybe this is just my personal theology making it harder for me to understand, because I feel like the idea of I'm just doing this to try to get into the kingdom, to me, that's the same concept of I know that in order to make it into heaven, I need to be a good person. And so I'm trying to be a better person. Part of this eternal reward, like in order to be a part of that, it's about who you are. It's not necessarily about like tallying up the good things that I do and being like, I want to make sure I'm doing this thing so that I get into heaven. No, it's like I want to make sure I'm the type of person who does this.
But that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is in the back of your mind. So let's use forgiveness as an example, right? That is like a common thing that across the board, it may be done in different practices, but the general consensus is that forgiveness, it wipes your slate clean. And a common theological talking point is unforgiven people won't make it into the kingdom. That may not be like where we may land on it, but the concept of forgiveness is not merit-based, but it does make salvation borderline quantifiable, because for many Christians, if you are unforgiven by the time Book of Judgment closes, or by the time you see God coming down, or for many people, the rapture, that's it.
How would you be unforgiven?
By not asking for forgiveness. Like the act in and of itself for many Christians is how you are forgiven. If you are not actively seeking out repentance, your slate doesn't get wiped clean. I think that's more so what I'm getting at. And so if you are consistently working under that premise of constantly repenting and constantly asking for forgiveness, knowing that you have to make it right because the hour of the day is unknown for all mankind, it can feel like you're constantly beating the clock.
But this feels like something different than what you were saying before.
No, this is precisely what I'm getting at, particularly with those two examples of I am consistently doing this because there's something at the end there that I don't want to miss out on.
I think there are people that think about this the way that you think about it. I just think it's such a flawed, because the thing is, if your repentance isn't genuine, he knows.
So I think they are genuine, but I think that what makes it genuine is I want to be good. I truly want to be a good person because I don't want to miss out on heaven.
I guess the thing that complicates it for me is because the determination of whether or not you are a good person, a good enough person, quote unquote, to make it into heaven, right, is based on how you treat people here. Like, I feel like you can't actually separate them because one is dependent on the other. So, like, if your desire is, I want to be a good person because I want to go to heaven, like, you're still going to be trying to be a good person on earth.
But you're not doing it for other people, though. You're doing it for something that you want to not miss out on. Because I think the constant talk of repentance and forgiveness is one where it is solely based on, if you don't do this, that can be the determining factor of you getting something good or getting something bad at the end. But nowhere in the motive are people mentioning you doing this because you could be doing something good or something bad for people right now here on earth.
I guess that hasn't been my experience with Christian. I don't deny that it is true. When I see like certain people online and stuff say things, I do get those ideas from them. But when I talk to Christians that I actually know, that's not the most common idea.
I want to talk a little bit about the books I've been reading, but I was also reading a lot on X-Men. Most important piece in Marvel, in my humble opinion. But one of the things that really stood out to me is how, like, there may be some flaws in certain instances of like the execution of it, like the story of mutants, but I do feel like mutants can serve as the perfect and perhaps the most inclusive way to talk about marginalized communities, because so many marginalized communities can find representation in the X-Men story. As a Black person, you can understand that struggle from like a structural systemic point of view of the things that they're going through. You can see clear resemblance there. But I also thought of like trans people and how a lot of these mutants change their names, and how a lot of them go through like dead naming from people who are definitely not accepting of the new name that they've given themselves. There's obviously some parallels with like immigrants and refugees. There are so many ways that you can take this story, because exploring a social identity through a mutant, I have not found any other character or medium that can do it where it lands so well like mutants can. And so I feel like Jack Kirby and Stan Lee, they struck gold when it came to this idea. And I don't know if they knew back then that they'd be able to use that story to share and talk about like a plethora of different marginalized groups. But seeing how different people, like even people in the disability community, have seen certain characters, you know, obviously like Charles Xavier, and see that as a representation for themselves, just I wanted to commend them on that. I've also been trying to make sense out of all this Targaryen stuff that I've been reading. One of the things that became like apparent for me as I was reading these books is the Targaryens can definitely be seen as a representation for imperialists, but there is also like a clear problem with this idea of prophecy. And I saw a strong resemblance to how they treated this prophecy that Aegon was given about this long night that's coming, and kind of like how like Christians treat like the gospel. You're holding two things at the same time, where you're definitely like colonizing these groups of people, and you're convincing yourself that you're doing it for a reason that's going to save their life. And Targaryens are kind of doing the same thing at a lot of different instances throughout their history. They come to that country and like no one in Westeros asked them to be there. And even this idea of the long night that obviously is true, they're convinced that they have to be the saviors of this country as opposed to being a contributor in helping Westeros save themselves. And I feel like that distinction feels very intentional with what I believe George R. Martin is critiquing, because you see Christians do that a lot. I remember being in a seminary class where I'm listening to this guy. I'm like, dude, the savior complex that a lot of these missionaries have is like, you can try to teach it in like these courses. It's just unavoidable just due to the nature, especially in these like short mission trips, because there's nothing you can do there. You're there just for a couple of weeks, and there's nothing sustainable. There's no agency being brought to these people. It's just you thinking that you have to save them. For a lot of the Targaryens, the way prophecy had crippled Targaryens for several generations, it felt like a reminder for how Christians have used prophecy for decades, and how a lot of not just consequence, but like avoidable consequences Westeros went through. And it is all sort of based on this idea of this prophecy that Targaryens are sort of addicted to. And it's not just Aegon's prophecy. They get dreams all the time for a lot of different reasons. And in many of the instances, they interpret their dreams as things that will benefit them a lot of times. And so the way that they move, you're trying to will what you want this prophecy to be, what this dream to be, so that it can sort of benefit you in the end. And I was kind of thinking about like, you know, like we've seen instances of this in like real life, where when you're not careful, like prophecy can become like a very dangerous thing. Obviously, like being Adventist, like one of the first things I thought of was like the Great Disappointment in 1844, right? You had all these people like convinced of this particular prophecy that God was going to come. And so they sold all their land. Some of these people, they didn't get married. They left their families because some of their families weren't convinced of that same prophecy, and nothing happened. And I always was curious about like what happened afterwards when these prophecies that these people were so convinced of doesn't come into fruition. And George R. R. Martin's books on the Targaryens can give you a glimpse of like the aftermath of it all, because the common folk are left that they're hurt the most. Relationships are like ruined, like lineages and generations like are just gone, like they just sort of never even existed because of these obsessions. Like in the Dunk and Egg story, I feel like if you wanted to name like the most tragic king in Westeros, it would definitely be Egg. And his story is so sad because he never really wanted to be king, but as often in Westeros, all of the predecessors, they lose their life, and then he is the one that sort of takes the throne. And he goes on all these adventures with Dunk, and he learns to appreciate everyone that is considered like common folk. Like the least of these, that's where he's spending all of his time, just like on the road. He's not with like highborn lords and rich people. He's just with regular people. And when he comes of age, he takes all of those values and all those lessons into his politics. So when he becomes king, he's implementing all of these ideas to like help make the lives of common folk better. And the people that are like highborn, they like hate it. They despise that he's doing all these rules that like are somewhat equitable to an extent. And he's constantly hit with rebellions, primarily because of that reason, for a lot of highborn lords, because they don't want this idea of anything resembling leveling the playing field. And as that's happening, he's convinced the only way for his real vision of a better future to come into fruition is that like he needs dragons. And this is after Dance of the Dragons. So like dragons are gone at that point because of the Civil War. And so he's got this vision going on, and he kind of again becomes consumed by it. Aegon, when he's king, he's a little bit older. He brings pretty much the entire Targaryen lineage to this place called Summerhall. And we don't know what happens there, but a crazy fire takes place. The people who survived won't talk about it. The maester who was alive at that time, he blotted out that part in history with ink. And so like there's a few words you can read, but you're not really sure what happened. But they definitely mentioned things like fire being used. They definitely mentioned Aegon doing something that was dangerous. And so a lot of people are suspecting that, again, he kind of became consumed with this idea of dragons and the dreams he was having to fulfill his prophecy of making a better future. And then in the end, he borderline wipes out like the entire Targaryen dynasty, except for like 3 people alive at that time, which is why when Robert's Rebellion happened, there's only Aerys and like a couple of his kids alive at that time. It's because of what happened at Summerhall there. And I think people are suspecting he tried to bring forth a dragon, very similar to what Daenerys did. It just doesn't work out. His character was always tragic because he genuinely did start off with like good intentions. It also just kind of reminded me of like, we're sort of seeing this right now where whatever Egg was supposed to represent, this person that was trying to be a voice for the people, whatever visions he was trying to bring forth into fruition were always blocked by like these honestly like rich oligarchs who were not on board with things leveling the playing field. And it feels so resemblant to what is happening right now, like in our country, right? You've got people trying to unionize, and you've got certain leaders that are trying to implement certain ideas into governance, and nothing can get through because you've got a number of rich people that have such a large monopoly on so many different sectors in our country, and like nothing can move forward. And I think Dunk and Egg was like a huge reminder of like who gets impacted the most in situations like that, and how a lot of these rich people are not just disconnected from the rest of the world. I don't think they have an interest in wanting to do that either. A lot of people think like the Mad King or Maegor the Cruel is like the worst king in Westeros. I actually think like they're up there, but personally, I think there's another individual And his name is Aegon the Unworthy. A lot of Aegons. I don't know why they did that. And he's got like 20 different bastards, right? And so you know how like the Westerosi politics work. Like they don't really have a claim to the throne. Before he dies, he legitimizes all of them. And so that turns essentially into this Blackfire rebellion. And so a lot of people look at the Dance of the Dragons as the thing that really ends the Targaryen dynasty. But at least they still had like numbers. They still had some kind of authority. The Blackfire Rebellion is kind of what spirals things into what happens at Summerhall with Egg. And you even see resemblance of the fighting still happening with the Blackfires and the Targaryens, even in the original books, where people are like still trying to get a Blackfire on the throne. It's just there's just a lot there happening. But it just sort of reminded me of like when people think about the end of the Targaryen dynasty, they always think about the Mad King or they think about the dance. But I feel like the Blackfire Rebellion and what Aegon the Unworthy did with his kids, I feel like had a much harsher consequence on the Targaryen dynasty and like them not being unified. And you sort of see that. And with that, thank you all again, and we'll see you all next time. Peace.